Secondly, it is a voluntary compact with the men in power to procure liberty upon bond to answer again, and cannot be called necessitated. Or if it be, it is but a necessitated sin. It must be voluntary, because it is an act of the will, and the will cannot be forced. It is the consent of the will, and the consent cannot but be voluntary, insofar as it is a consent. And by this, whereas before their so procured liberty they were prisoners by constraint, now when they must return to prison, they are prisoners by consent. It is the prisoner's choice whether he will come out upon these terms or not, and every choice, insofar as it is a choice, is elective or voluntary. It is put to the man's choice whether he will continue under the cross and continue his testimony for the cause, or surcease from it for a time. The latter in the case is chosen. It is the prisoner's desire and petition to transact with them in these terms for liberty, without which no benefit of any such bond can be procured, and every desire is voluntary. Yea, it is a formal compact and capitulation with them, binding and obliging these bonders by their own word and writ, at least to be at their call and command, not by compulsion and force now, but by the moral obligation of their own compact now every such compact is voluntary. And therefore, if all voluntary covenants, confederacies, and agreements be discharged in Scripture, then this bond of compearance also must be discharged. The judgment of the famous Mr. Rutherford, of a draft of a petition to have been presented to the Committee of Estates by those ministers who were prisoners in the Castle of Edinburgh, will confirm what is said. We find it in the third part of his letters, number 93, where are these words, quote, "I am straitened as another suffering man, but dare not petition this committee, first, because it draws us to capitulate with such as have the advantage of the mount, the Lord so disposing for the present, and to bring the matters of Christ to yea and no, you being prisoners and they the powers, is a hazard." Unquote. Third, this agreement with the enemies for liberty upon these terms is sinful. For it is not only an acknowledgment of a wicked power in owning and transacting with them as judges, who can free them and bind them as prisoners by law, which is disproved above, but it is a binding themselves over to a pact perverse and law-perverting judicatory, not as prisoners by forcible constraint, but a willing consent, acknowledging the legality of their imprisonment, and obliging themselves to observe it when demanded. Yea, it is a covenanted and bonded obedience to a wicked law. For it is a wicked law to exact from a sufferer for truth his reentry to prison, for no crime but his duty. As also it is a justifying of a wicked sentence, for it is a wicked sentence that an innocent man shall return to prison when they please, which is justified when they bind themselves to obey it. This is no ways like a man's going to the gibbet on his own feet. For the man does not bind himself to do that, neither is it exacted of him as an obedience to a law, nor is it given forth as a part of his sentence, only he chooseth it for his own ease. But if all these did concur, it were unlawful for a martyr for righteousness to obey such a law, or voluntarily to submit to such a wicked sentence. Neither is it of any pertinency to urge that it is lawful for a man to submit so far to a robber as to bind himself to return to him against such a day with another purse to him. For this is a necessitated bargain, to give what a man hath, and promise more to save his life, and is like a man's casting his goods out at sea to save the ship. The other is not so, but elective. This is only a choice of the least of two evils of suffering, but the other is a choice of one of two evils, which is sin, which cannot come under a Christian's election at all. This is a compact with the robber, which is still discretive, and no ways unitive of the robber and him in any bargain of concord or confederacy or acknowledged subjection, only a passive surrender to his greater force as an enemy. But the other is unitive, as between rulers and ruled. This is not any obedience to a law, nor is the man's purse required to be given or promised under that notion as the other is. I shall here also subjoin some more of that foresaid letter of Mr. Rutherford's. In the second place, he says, quote, "A speaking to them in writ, and passing in silence the sworn covenant and the cause of God, which is the very present controversy, is contrary to the practice of Christ and the apostles, who, being accused or not accused, avouched Christ to be the Son of God and the Messiah, and that the dead must rise again, even when the adversary misstated the question." Unquote. Now plain it is that neither in the bonds nor petitions is there any word of the cause or testimony suffered for. Fourthly, as it is sinful, so it is very scandalous in several respects, and that at least it hath the appearance of evil, which Christians should abstain from, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 22, and seems to be a voluntary subjecting themselves to their impositions, at least of that to return to prison again, a willing acknowledgment of their unjust usurpations, a spontaneous consenting to their mischiefs framed into a law, and exacted under the notion of the law, a gratifying of the enemies of religion, and pleasing them more than anything a prisoner can do, except he should wholly deny the cause. And therefore chiefly always this overture is most acceptable from those that durst give any testimony, because they look upon it as some indication of their fainting or falling from it, or of their wearying of the cross of Christ, of which they are very glad. And in offending and making sad the hearts and condemning the practice of some truly tender and zealous confessors of Christ, who have had strong temptations to make such transactions and durst not yield so far for a world. Yea, it is certainly an argument of faithless fear and impatient wearying of the cross, because of the fury of the oppressor, which the Lord taxeth, when the captive hasteneth, that he may be loosed, and that he should not die in the pit, nor that his bread should fail, which is a dishonor to him who hath promised to bear their charges, and hath given them many encouragements to trust, that he will open a door in his own time and way. See Isaiah 51, verses 13 and 14. Of this Rutherford addeth in that forecited letter, quote, silence of the cause of God which adversaries persecute seems a tacit deserting of the cause, when the state of the question is known to beholders, and I know the brethren intend not to leave the cause. And a little after, says he, the draft of that petition which you sent me speaks not one word of the covenant of God, for the adhering to which you now suffer, and which is the object of men's hatred, and the destruction whereof is the great work of the times. And your silence in this nick of time appears to be a not confessing of Christ before men, and you want nothing to beget an uncleanly deliverance, but the profession of silence, unquote, which is professed by all that petition for such a bond, when they address and transaction, when their address and transaction, speaks no more in favors of the cause than if they denied it. It is plainly a coming out of prison without a testimony, which cannot consist with faithful and zealous suffering for Christ, and is far from the choice of Christ's witnesses, who overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, recorded, Hebrews 11, verse 35, who were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Fifthly, as it is a scandalous, so it is very inconvenient and unsuitable for the confessors of Christ, in that not only they may be ignorant and much troubled to know what underhanded dealings their friends may use sometimes to procure that liberty without acquainting them, and how odiously their acts of deliverance may be worded and registered to the prejudice of the cause, which they dare not testify against afterwards when they do know it, for fear of the many inconveniences. But also it cannot be vindicated from being a dishonorable shifting and putting off or casting off the call of a testimony, and confessing either an inconstancy or impatience or unreadiness or want of resolution to confess or profess the testimony for Christ, without some respite to gather new defenses for it, whereas Christ's witnesses should be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh them a reason of the hope that is in them. 1 Peter 3, verse 15. And besides, they involve themselves into the encumbrances of a doubtful suspense about the event, whereas if they keep their first resolution and condition with cheerfulness, aloof from such bargains, they know the utmost that have to fear or hope from men. But now, as it is hard for them to come off without some sinful engagement, and to continue any measure of faithfulness when they are out, for fear of being soon called again, so they bring themselves into many sad difficulties how to behave, and cast themselves into many temptations unavoidably. However, except of late, a precedent of this practice can hardly be instanced among the sufferers of Christ in former times, but on the contrary, many have refused such offers. I shall only name one. In the persecution of Queen Mary of England, Dr. Sands, prisoner at London, had the offer of liberty upon the term of such a bond, finding bail to appear when he should be called, but refused it absolutely. And when a gentleman, without his knowledge, having procured it by giving 1,000 bond for him, brought him forth and required his consent and observance of the obligation, he would not consent to give any security, and denied his resolution to observe it in the least. Whereupon the gentleman very courteously told him he would stand to his hazard. This was far more like the innocency of the dove, but this new prudence resembles more the wisdom of the serpent. Finally, as for Jason's business, which is so much harped upon by these bonders, first, these were rulers that he had to deal withal, and not raging tyrants. Second, they were indifferent arbiters between Jason and the lewd fellows that troubled him, and not both judge and party. He gave no security to his persecutors as these bonders do, but to the true judges of the cause, who impartially took cognizance of it, from whom Jason might and did expect right. Third, this was before he was prisoner, being as free as his accusers, and having the law as free for him as it was for them, whereby he could vindicate himself and abide in the law, and be absolved by it, which does not answer the case of prisoners actually engaged in and called to a testimony for Christ, when there is no law but what is established in opposition to Christ. Fourth, in the original it is when they got satisfaction from him, that is, when he so cleared himself that they could not fasten any transgression upon him, then they absolved him. Number 2. All these oaths and solemn securities that have been imposed in these times are dreadful and heinous breaches of the third command, by taking his name in vain in the worst sort, whereby the takers cannot be holden guiltless. For it is impossible such oaths and bonds, however they be constructed, can ever be taken with these requisite qualifications necessary to be observed in all oaths, and consequently in all solemn promises or bonds that are mentioned once for all, Jeremiah 4, verse 2, where one that sweareth must do it in truth, in judgment, and in righteousness. First, they cannot be taken in truth, which is a necessary qualification in all oaths according to the definition of a true oath, which is a solemn invocation of God, for confirmation of some true, lawful, grave, and weighty, useful, and worthy business, wherein he is attested and appealed unto, that he, as the only searcher of hearts, may give his testimony to the truth in the thing, and punish the swearers, if he swear not in the truth. And this swearing in truth does import and require both sincerity of the heart, filled with reverence, and the awful apprehension of a present God, and simplicity of the mind, well informed of the genuine meaning of the oath, that we have clear uptaking of it, and take it not implicitly, but with our own understanding, and also singleness and honesty of the intention, that it be not to deceive by putting any other sense than the imposer hath, or will allow when he understands it. So the meaning must be clear, and such as may be obviously gathered from the words, and according as they are supposed to be understood by others, especially them that exact the oath. For if they mean one thing and we another, God's name is profaned, and the end of the oath frustrated, and so all equivocations and mental reservations are condemned, as all divines treating on oaths teach, and worthy Mr. Durham particularly on the third command, who asserts, quote, that though we could devise some other meaning that might seem to make for us, yet if that was not meant at first tendering, but otherwise understood by him that did take it, it will not absolve from the guilt of perjury for an oath of strict law, and will not admit on any respect or account of interpretations prejudicial to the native truth of it, lest it should be found to be, according to Psalm 24, verse 4, a swearing deceitfully, unquote. And afterwards he says, quote, much less will it exempt a man from guilt, that in swearing he hath a meaning of the words contrary to what in common sense they bear, and in the construction of all indifferent persons, without oath or beyond it, but it should be plain, single, and clear, unquote. And Piraeus saith in Catechism URS Part 2, Question 102, an oath hath the divine sanction, that it might be a bond of verity among men, and a testimony that God is the author and defender of the truth.